Hi there, Chris, Chapping the Cap, Motor Legends. Today I'm going to try to answer the question, what is a single layer motorcycle gene? And as part of that, I'm going to try to explain the differences between what we call a single layer gene and a line gene, sometimes known as a Kevlar gene. This is another video, therefore, that's only going to be of interest to some people. I'm imagining, for example, that a lot of our customers will know full well the difference between single layer genes and Kevlar genes. But not everybody out there is quite so enlightened, so we're putting out this video to explain the differences to those people who are perhaps still a little confused. Now, bikers have been wearing jeans pretty much forever. Back in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, there were few options. You either rode in leather or you rode in denim. Leather clearly is very protective, leather looks fantastic, is great to wear, but it was not for everybody. And wearing leather off the bike requires, shall we say, a certain commitment, which is why a generation of bikers grew up riding their bikes in jeans. Think Steve McQueen, think James Dean, think Marlon Brando et al. Now, riding a bike was always a cool undertaking, but riding a bike in a pair of Levi's was cooler still. But as bikes got faster, the inadequacies of denim became ever more apparent. And then some 30 years ago, some bright spark came up with the idea of lining a jean with this latest military-inspired fabric called Kevlar. Those early jeans looked absolutely hideous. They were not nice to ride in, they were not nice to walk about in. But what cannot be denied is they did a job. In the intervening years since those first Kevlar jeans were introduced onto the market, the concept has been somewhat refined. Today, makers of line jeans don't always, for example, use Kevlar, even though such jeans are still known by most people as Kevlar jeans. Kevlar, in fact, is just a brand of a particular weave of aramid fibres. There are many other such weaves on the market. More recently, manufacturers have started lining their jeans with linings that are actually way stronger than Kevlar. But there is a key problem that pertains to all line jeans, namely, they have a lining. Now, line jeans have a propensity to be quite heavy, and one has to ask the question, why would anybody really want to wear a heavy jean? They're not particularly comfortable, but the main issue is that the lining acts as an insulator, so they're not particularly breathable, and when it's warm you're going to get hot and sweaty on the inside. So on warmer days when you really want to wear a jean, they're just not nice to ride in. Nobody, for example, gets out of bed on a sunny summer's morning, looks out and goes, I want to go for a ride on my bike, where are my favourite heavy padded trousers? But for many years, in truth, there just wasn't much of a choice. If you wanted to ride in jeans and you wanted to stay protected, very simply, you bought yourself a pair of Kevlar jeans. It was, I believe, the Italian brand Spidi that first developed the concept of the single layer jean. Single layer jean meaning that a jean that is woven with another fabric into the denim to create a single fabric that gives you the required protection. Now, Spidi as a company always had a strong jean offering, but over time they found that many of their compatriots preferred the idea of wearing a lighter weight jean because obviously it's pretty hot in Italy. Indeed, you only have to drive down the Autostrada to realise this. When some guy on a sports bike comes flying past you, you'll have a Valentino Rossi t-shirt on, maybe a pair of flip-flops and perhaps a pair of shorts. Spidi's early jeans were, it has to be said, pretty basic by modern standards. They would be woven with denim and cordura. They would look something like this. In fact, this is a jean that is still in the Spidi range. It is a jean called the J Tracker. It feels just like a normal denim jean, but it's way stronger than a normal street jean. They are as easy to wear as a normal street jean, and importantly, they look like normal street jeans. In hot weather, of course, they are so much nicer to ride in. Now, these days, there are many manufacturers of single layer jeans, although it's probably true to say that the more traditional manufacturers who have concentrated and specialized in Kevlar jeans have been a little bit slower to transition into the 21st century than some of the younger, more dynamic brands. These days, some of the single layer jeans on the market are truly astonishing. If you were to turn them inside out, you would not imagine that they had great protective qualities, but I can assure you they do. The best ones are made with materials that are stronger than Kevlar. The very strongest tend to be woven with a fabric known as a UHMWPE. Now that's an ultra high molecular weight polyethylene. I have to admit that doesn't mean much to me, but it's a super strong material that is used in the aerospace industry, has military applications, and it's used in the creation of those bridges that span rivers a mile wide. It is 30 times stronger than carbon steel, and let's face it, carbon steel sounds pretty strong, yet this material is light enough to float on water. The beauty of jeans made with a UHMWPE is that they wear like street jeans. I've got a pair of these jeans on here. They feel just like Levi jeans. In fact, these are my favorite jeans bar none. I would wear these every day if I could. Importantly, they are really nice to ride in, and they're equally nice to walk around in when you get off the bike. But jeans like this really come into their own when the weather is really hot, because there's nothing nicer to ride in when it's warm than a single layer jean, because they flow air almost like a mesh trouser. Now that doesn't mean that single layer jeans are always going to be your best option. In colder weather, you could make a case for wearing traditional Kevlar jeans. These jeans may be heavy, but because you've got this super thick lining, they're always going to help you stay warm, even though, it's got to admit, they might not make you look particularly fly. Quite reasonably, people ask, what is strongest, what is the most abrasion resistant, a Kevlar jean or a single layer jean? But personally, I think that question is somewhat fatuous. It's a little bit like asking, what's the fastest car? Is it a petrol car or is it an electric car? And the answer, of course, depends on the model, it depends on the car in question. It's the same when we're looking at Kevlar jeans versus single layer jeans. Some Kevlar jeans are very strong and very abrasion resistant, some not so much. Some single layer jeans are very strong, others not so strong. But there is an issue with line jeans that you simply don't get with single layer jeans. And that is that some line jeans are more lined than others. The strongest, most protective line jeans have 100% lining on the inner surface of the denim. The problem with those jeans, however, is that they are the heaviest, the hottest, and the most uncomfortable to wear. But some jeans are only lined or only partially lined, like these jeans here. And in some jeans, you might only get 20% of the surface area of the jean covered with Kevlar. So in a jean like this, you'll get a little bit of Kevlar in the seat of the pant. You might get a little bit over the knees. Jeans like this, it's got to be said, are going to be easier to wear, but you'll only get protection in the specific designated areas. And a lot of people who go out and buy Kevlar jeans just haven't realised that the rest of the jean, this part of the jean that isn't covered with Kevlar, all you're buying there is a standard piece of denim. One of the key benefits, by contrast with a single layer jean, is whatever the layer of, or whatever the level of protection is, be it a high or medium or a low level of protection, you're going to get that level of protection throughout the entire jean. And so the difference between a single layer jean and a Kevlar jean, your decision as to whether to go for a single layer jean or a line jean, will not come down, in our view, to some kind of binary analysis of the relative strength, abrasion resistance and slide times of the two forms of construction. You can, after all, as we've discussed, decide on the level of protection you want in a jean. The difference between the two forms of construction, in our view, comes down to your perceptions or your views regarding comfort and how you want to feel when you're riding the bike. We recently, to this end, ordered a pair of Kevlar jeans from a well-known UK maker of Kevlar jeans. In fact, all they make is Kevlar jeans, and this is that jean. It is rated AAA under EN 17092, the latest CE regulations. It does not get higher than AAA, and so we have absolutely no doubts whatsoever about the protective qualities of these jeans. But in looking at the comfort, looking at how they're going to feel when you're wearing them and when you're riding the bike, when we put them on the scales, we can see that these jeans come in at 1.9 kilograms, so not far short of 2 kilograms. If I take my favorite street jeans, these are my Edwin jeans, these come in at 0.6 of a kilogram. So these line jeans are 3 times heavier than my street jeans. I am not clearly trying to draw any comparison between the protective qualities of these jeans. This Kevlar jean is going to be supremely protective. There is no protection whatsoever in my street jeans. But my point is this: when we wear a protective jean, what we're trying to replicate is the feeling of wearing a street jean. That is the nirvana, as it were, a protective jean that wears like a street jean. And in my view, a jean that wears 3 times heavier than your street jean is just not going to deliver you that feeling of freedom that you get when you're wearing a street jean. If we compare this AAA rated Kevlar jean with this jean, now this is a brand new jean, it's not yet on the market, it's coming through very soon. This is also a AAA rated jean from Roka. So it's going to give you pretty similar levels of protection. But when I put this on the scales, it comes in at 1.1 kilograms. By my calculation, what that means is that the Kevlar jean is going to come in at between 60 and 70% heavier than the single layer jean. But the bottom line here is that both jeans are going to give you similar levels of protection. It is true, of course, that lined jeans are nearly always going to be less expensive, and that's because lined jeans are fairly unsophisticated, they're not particularly technical, and they are very simple to make. All you do, you order yourself up some denim fabric, you knock them up into a jean, and then you buy a few meters of Kevlar that you sew in as a lining. What this means is that a lined jean is always going to give you more bang for your buck. So for every pound you spend, you're going to get perhaps a higher level of protection. But by contrast, a single layer jean is always going to be nicer to wear on the bike. We all clearly want to ride safely. In either jean, in either form of construction, as we've discussed, you can decide on the level of protection that you want. But if you value comfort, if you want to wear your protective jeans like a pair of Levi's, if you want to be able to walk around all day when you get off the bike in your protective jeans, if you want to be able to keep cool when the weather's really hot, you're probably going to err towards a single layer jean. But as ever, that's a personal choice.